this is still happening in our country. And my belief is it needs to stop. We need to stop penalizing everyday people for accessing and using the payment system. And the fear of this type of outcome, both for individuals, but also for institutions, has led to this massive de-risking where banks and people just stay away from things. Well, it's pretty hard to knock the US dollar off its perch, and Trump hasn't done it yet, but he certainly has given it a black eye. I mean, the combination of tariffs and basically the sort of the reverse brain drain, if we're going to basically have a really unfriendly approach to immigrants, sort of the opposite of the melting pot, kind of like the burning pot, keep kicking people out, both that we need for blue collar, manual labor, as well as the top of the market, really creates a pretty horrible business environment in the United States. It's not part of the government. It's independent of the government in 1913. And ever since then, it's been solid as a rock. In fact, many people trust the Fed more than they trust the United States. I mean, the United States could go bankrupt and the Fed could keep going operating. And the Fed has three functions. It does monetary policy. A book written by Ron Heifetz. I mean, I studied also at Harvard under David Gergen, a much more traditional leadership type person who worked for a bunch of different presidents. He was great. But Ron Heifetz had a different approach, which is, how do you lead when you don't actually have formal authority? How do you lead bottom up by getting people motivated who you're not the boss of those people? And so he gave examples like Martin Luther King or Gandhi and whatnot, but lots of other people that are not in positions of power still getting things done. Now, the more traditional top-down approach is, I'm the boss, I won the election, I'm the CEO, I'm going to tell everybody what to do, and I'm going to tell them how to jump, and then they just jump. And so we're obviously in a period right now where we have a very top-down leader, and every day there's some new directive, some new chaos out there where he's testing all the boundaries of what the Supreme Court can still do and what Congress can do. And basically, we had a system in this country of checks and balances. That system is being tested very, very heavily now. And clearly a bunch of people that don't really care about that system of checks and balances and don't really see a problem with the executive branch of the government stepping on the toes of the Supreme Court and Congress. And we are on the verge of a constitutional crisis.
Hey, Greg. So a couple of weeks ago, you shared this great story with me. The guy's a CFO at a top tech company. You know, he's an immigrant to the U.S., but he was a U.S. citizen, at the time, and went through quite an ordeal. Do you want to tell that story and also explain why it resonated with you, why it's important?
Sure. This is a story about what happens in a country where it professes to be for open banking and fair access. This chap was an immigrant from Iran, went to Berkeley undergraduate, and went and got a PhD at Princeton and was working for McKinsey and received proceeds from his mother's divorce settlement in Iran into an account that he controlled, and found himself faced with a tactical SWAT squad, armed to the teeth, that arrested him. And he ended up spending 22 months in jail for being accused of violating Iranian sanctions. And there's an exception if you receive money from a family matter that's not covered, but the judge did not let that be brought into court, did not offer him bail. And here's someone who is doing all the right things, crossing all the T's, dotting all the I's. And in our country system, this happened actually under the Obama administration, went to prison for 22 months. And finally, when he finally got out and got his name cleared, he still is on a blacklist and can't get a bank account opened at Chase, right? And so to this day, this cloud hangs over him of being a felon, even if wrongly convicted, sent to prison. And so this is still happening in our country. And my belief is it needs to stop. We need to stop penalizing everyday people for accessing and using the payment system. And the fear of this type of outcome, both for individuals, but also for institutions, has led to this massive de-risking where banks and people just stay away from things. And it just creates a new form of a pernicious form of discrimination. And we hope through open banking and fair access to put an end to it. And so our commitment is to make situations like this never happen. This chap today is actually the CFO for one of the most known fintechs out there, and yet still can't get a bank account on Chase. It's a real travesty of justice.
Right. I mean, he graduated from top schools. He was working at a top consulting firm at the time, and basically got immediately locked up for almost 2 years for essentially being accused of being a terrorist financier.
He had to use what are called the informal transfer system to have the money transferred, et cetera, and whatnot. And because there wasn't a system like what we're looking to do with USBC, where you could just move the money transparently between the sender and the receiver, both known identities, the fact that it had to go through a circuitous route because, again, there is no access to the traditional correspondent banking rails for that transaction, just created this cloud of shame and disapproval that actually took on a legal manifestation that cost him his liberty for 22 months.
Got it. Well, the good news is that in 2021, he did receive a full presidential pardon. So there is some validation there at the very least.
He did receive a presidential pardon, but there's still a cloud hanging over him because when he told the FBI that he had received the money from his family, he said he received it from his uncle, who he did, but the money originally came from his father because that's who was in the divorce. And the FBI has used that to say, well, you didn't tell us the truth, right? It really came from your father, not your uncle, even though the uncle was the one who transferred the money. And on that technicality, he still has an outstanding charge that wasn't pardoned for, right? Which was basically lying to the FBI. And so those types of little digs are still there. It's still a way of, our government giving people a kick in the pants to show, who's the boss, right? And so even with a presidential pardon, his name is still not fully cleared.
Got it. Yeah, it seems like they really tried to make an example out of him.
They did, and it's happened in other cases and other situations. But, it's fearful both for individuals, but also for the institutions involved in banking these people. And so we have, when we're looking out there, whole countries of people, like Venezuela is another example, where one of our portfolio companies, Uphold, had 1 million people banked, right? And they were using basically stable coins and the US dollar in Venezuela because the currency there and the government is essentially non-functioning. And again, the current host bank for Uphold is uncomfortable, has an uncomfortable relationship with their regulator, and just told Uphold that, hey, if you want to bank with us, you have to kick all those people to the curb. And so that type of de-risking is still happening. We hope it happens less. We hope to put an end to it.
And because, as you mentioned, the payment that he received was perfectly legal, but there were no above board, payment options, payment rails, payments with identity. And so unfortunately, he had to use these informal, what are they called, Hawala systems?
It's called the Hawala. And it's a series of money transmitters that you have to use when the formal banking system isn't available. I studied it when I was at the Fed. It was a particular study project for me, for the governors, to understand why so many people use the Hawala versus like Western Union or a bank. And it's pretty simple. It's cheap, it's fast, and it's trusted. It's actually more trusted than the banking and Western Union type rails. It's especially popular in Muslim areas of the world. It's a huge network of agents that do these disbursements.
Speaking of the need for payment systems, Circle, one of the largest provider of stablecoins in the world, and a lot of other companies in the digital asset space, it seems like a lot of them are looking to get their bank charters. It seems like you are a couple steps ahead, understanding the need for a bank in the digital asset industry. Do you want to talk a little bit about those motivations?
Sure. I mean, it used to be like 50 to 100 new banks or more every year up till 2008. And then with the financial crisis, the Obama administration put a lockdown on that. And there have been maybe 1 or 2 new charters a year since 2008. And it's been very hard for people to buy an existing bank if they're not already a bank. Myself and Jackie Reese for Lead Bank, we're like really 2 of the only fintech people that were able to buy a bank during the Biden administration. It shouldn't be that hard. There shouldn't be this much of a drag or block to innovation, but there has been. Now, supposedly that's going to change. We're doing our part to help it change by creating a new payments bank charter in Nevada. There's several other states that are beginning to innovate. And with a change at the top of the administration, there's a friendlier attitude toward people starting or getting into the banking industry that aren't already in it. And so I do think we'll see a flurry of activity. It still takes a lot of time, a lot of effort to get a bank, but I think we will see innovation and entry into the banking industry again. And we hope to open the gates in Nevada at the end of this year after the legislation passes for folks that are looking for specialty bank charters to focus on things like payments and deposit taking rather than traditional lending and branch banking. So I think Circle, others, some of our portfolio companies are going to look to get those bank charters. We already have one, but the water's great. We hope folks come in. We want other folks in because we're looking to build a consortium of banks behind USBC. And so the more the merrier from where we sit.
So you've spoken a lot about your mission in terms of, providing fair and open access to banking for people around the world, fair and open access to, the US dollar to people around the world. You've also been very outspoken about, Trump's leadership approach at the moment. And it seems like he's doing quite a bit of damage to the credibility of the US dollar. Do you want to speak about that?
Well, it's pretty hard to knock the US dollar off its perch. And Trump hasn't done it yet, but he certainly has given it a black eye. I mean, the combination of tariffs and basically the sort of the reverse brain drain, if we're going to basically have a really unfriendly approach to immigrants, sort of the opposite of the melting pot, kind of like the burning pot, just basically keep kicking people out, both that we need for bunch of blue collar manual labor as well as the top of the market, really creates a pretty horrible business environment in the United States. Just on top of that, the uncertainty going on where these tariffs are changing, they're on, they're off. Nobody can really plan for the future. And with the Fed being dour on the outcome, and Mr. Powell saying that looks like tariffs are a form of a tax, that's going to increase prices, it's going to slow growth down. You're going to have a situation where you might cause a recession or depression, which normally would result in lower interest rates. But because you've done it in such a really obnoxious way of whacking tariffs on that could cause inflation to accelerate, Trump's not getting the dividend of a rate cut from the Fed, and he's mad as hell about that. And so there's like a triple witching hour of doing everything possible you can to hurt the U.S.'s reputation in the marketplace. And you're seeing the dollars come way off. But look, still, as a means of exchange, dollar's the best thing around. I don't see anything closer to it. We're just going through a period where we're kind of doing as much self-inflicted wounds as possible, but I don't think we've knocked the dollar off the top perch. So we're still very bullish on the dollar long term, even if Trump is kind of dragging us through the mud right now.
Fed's in a tough spot, right? If they're focused on fighting potential inflation, they don't have too many tools in the toolbox to help the economy potentially. You had a stint at the Federal Reserve. One of, I would say, the current hot topics is the amount of pressure it seems Trump is putting on the Fed. Do you want to speak on the importance of Fed independence?
The whole point of Fed independence goes all the way back to Hamilton when we did pay back the debts from the Revolution. And since then, the rest of the world has always looked to the U.S. as a place that it pays its debts, in full and on time. And we've had our share of banking crises in the 19th century, but the Federal Reserve was set up by the government. It's not part of the government. It's independent of the government in 1913. And ever since then, it's been solid as a rock. In fact, many people trust the Fed more than they trust the United States. I mean, the United States could go bankrupt and the Fed could keep going operating. And the Fed has three functions. It does monetary policy. That's what we're talking about here. Sets the interest rates. It does do regulation. It does payments as well. But it is the bellwether for setting interest rates. Everybody else around the world looks at it. And we've run in a way that is really the opposite of Argentina, which uses its version of the Fed to basically turn on the printing press and just print money because the politicians ask it to do so. Essentially, Trump has asked the Fed to operate more like Argentina. And there was a time in history in 1910 when Argentina had the same size economy as the United States. Obviously, things have diverged since then. But Trump right now is looking to course correct and have us begin to behave in a way that really looks more like a banana republic where politicians just basically can turn on the printing press or lower interest rates just to meet their short-term political will and whims. And the result of that will be other countries are going to look at our currency like a joke, and they're not going to hold that anymore in their reserves. And so countries like China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, places that hold a lot of dollars, if they start dumping those dollars, the interest rate on our debt is going to go through the roof, and the competition for dollars that we already have to pay for Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, defense, that money is just going to be going to paying our debt. And so be very careful when you interfere with the independence of the Fed and cause the rest of the world to lose confidence in our currency, in our debt. And that's a game of fire. Now, Trump has made some threats, but he's backed off because he's seen how the markets react to that. But it's still not putting it behind him to kind of, once again, these are all self-inflicted wounds. No other country is doing this to us. We're just doing it to ourselves.
You mentioned Hamilton. What does it mean to be a Hamiltonian?
Well, a Hamiltonian, in the particular case, after the Revolutionary War, all these states had debts. They'd raised money independently. Some of them paid some of their debts back. Some had not. Rhode Island was a real deadbeat, for example. Virginia, pretty good. But Hamilton said, hey, look, we fought the war to create a country. We're going to pay back all the debts of the country, regardless of whether they were issued from the state or the Continental Congress. And he paid them all back in full. And that concept of what's best for the country, as opposed to what's best for this state or that state. Jefferson was more of a states person. Hamilton was like, what's good for the country. I'm a what's good for the country type person. It's not that I don't care about or don't think about states, but I think the states should experiment locally. But the responsibilities for something like this, like the solvency of the country, is a federal issue, not a state's issue. And so I believe when it comes to things like monetary policy, we should have a strong national policy, and it should be set for what's really good for the country, not for one political party or another. And that means the Fed needs to be independent. Hamilton tried to keep it independent. There was a certain president named Andrew Jackson, very Trumpian, and he made the Central Bank of the United States, the National Bank of the U.S., disappear during his administration. And we did not have one from the 1820s to 1913. And we had a tremendous number of financial collapses and failures during that period. And I don't want us as a country to return to that period. And I don't want us to return to a period or a path that looks like Argentina. And so to be a Hamiltonian means strong independence of the central bank and a focus at the national level for monetary policy rather than fragmenting the policies of the country down to the state level when it comes to financial affairs.
And so a lot of this really just comes down to, Trump's style of leadership, his art of the deal approach. He likes to foment chaos. There's a book that you often reference, Leadership on the Line. Are there any lessons from that book that you think could apply to the current situation?
Well, that book written by Ron Heifetz. I mean, I studied also at Harvard under David Gergen, a much more traditional leadership type person who worked for a bunch of different presidents. He was great. But Ron Heifetz had a different approach, which is how do you lead when you don't actually have formal authority? How do you lead bottom up by getting people motivated who you're not the boss of those people? And so he gave examples like Martin Luther King or Gandhi and whatnot, but lots of other people that are not in positions of power still getting things done. Now, the more traditional top-down approach is I'm the boss, I won the election, I'm the CEO, I'm going to tell everybody what to do, and I'm going to tell them how to jump, and then they just jump. And so we're obviously in a period right now where we have a very top-down leader, and every day there's some new directive, some new chaos out there where he's testing all the boundaries of what the Supreme Court can still do and what Congress can do. And basically, we had a system in this country of checks and balances. That system is being tested very, very heavily now. And, there's clearly a bunch of people that don't really care about that system of checks and balances and don't really see a problem with the executive branch of the government stepping on the toes of the Supreme Court and Congress. And we are on the verge of a constitutional crisis. Some people think we're already in one. But under that view, there's like this unitary view. The executive is all powerful. He won the election. And, Congress and Supreme Court are just out there to do his bidding. And we'll see how that goes. But the problem with that is that's kind of a one-way street. Once you go down that path, we kind of learned with Hitler. I mean, he was actually elected through a democratic process, but he sure put the kibosh on, ever going back to that. And so I'm not saying we're on the road to like Germany's path, but we certainly are in a situation where what we really treated as the thing that distinguishes the United States from other countries, this balance of power, checks and balances type thing, is being severely tested. And we could then become like any and every other country out there and not seen as a leader. And you can be a deal maker and just basically have everything be transactional. That's one positioning for the United States. The other was we basically stand for a system of rules, laws, and order, and we're the leader, but we basically adhere to those rules as opposed to just being a bigger bully than anybody else in our neighborhood or in the world. And, the bully thing works until it doesn't. And then when, the other folks out there get tired of you being the bully and team up, it can be a pretty ugly result. And so America on its own, without allies, basically shitting on the allies and kind of cozying up to the other bullies out there, that kind of works till it doesn't work. And, we've built up some goodwill, but like they say, it takes a long time to earn trust, but you can lose it quickly. And the U.S. is doing that quite quickly. I think there are still countries and folks out there that think this is a phase we're going through. And, Trump's like a bad weather storm and he'll be gone one day and we'll get back to being like a normal America that basically leads rather than treats everything as transactional deals where, anybody can be, thrown into the pit if it suits them for that one deal. There's no future goodwill. You don't need to have any goodwill. You can basically crap on anybody at any time, and they just have to take it because you got the biggest stick in the room.
And I feel that's sort of one of the disconcerting things about all of this, right? It feels like America is sort of receding from its role as, a leader of the world. It's isolating itself from its allies. I think tourism numbers have, dropped precipitously. People don't feel welcome here or they're not interested in visiting America in the same way. How do you see America's position in the world? Obviously times are very different since post World War II, but it's still an integral economy, an integral place.
People talk about the rise of China and the power of the Middle East, but if you look at the 20 top companies by market cap, 17 of them are still American. I mean, one is like the Saudi Aramco type thing. But none of those top 20 are from China, right? So the U.S. is still winning in this system. I mean, there's more competition. We're not as big a part of the GDP as we were, but let's be aware that we have been in a great position. We've been in the number one position. And to do all this stuff of putting up tariffs and basically building a moat around America, it's such a negative conception of the U.S. It's like we can't compete in this system where we're already winning. So we better put up tariff barriers and other types of barriers. We better be afraid of immigrants. We better be afraid of all these type things. And really the strategies that we're doing is rather than competing and winning, we basically are putting up the white flag. It's a loser strategy. And so I find it unfortunate we're sort of prematurely giving up and retreating into our shell and figuring out, well, let's just beat up on our neighbors like Canada and Greenland because, we're so much bigger and stronger than them that we can get away with it. It's like too daunting for us to actually compete in the world economy on a equal terms basis with China. And look, I know they say they're looking to try to do this to rebalance trade relations, et cetera, whatnot. And, we can see how that's going. I mean, after the first Trump administration, they put all this tariffs and penalties on China, and we ended up with a bigger trade deficit. And they're totally focused on goods and not services. We're really good at services. So why pick a fight on goods? Like, why not say, let's win in services rather than like try to go back to the 1950s and compete on who makes the best shoes in the world, right? So it's just a loser's mentality that we can't compete. And therefore we just have to like throw up our hands and put in all these controls and just look and turn inward. And we've been through this before in history when we've tried isolation and just gone internal. And, the result of that was World War I, which we eventually got dragged into, and World War II. It's never worked. Just like tariffs didn't work in terms of like staving off the depression and stuff. And yet it's like we have no memory of what's happened before in history. So we are going to like repeat that. So it is unfortunate, but we are doing all these things to ourselves. These are all self-inflicted wounds. Nobody else is doing this to us. But it makes good political theater. It sounds good on the campaign trail. It just as it did back when we did isolationism, leading up to World War I and leading up to World War II. There's a certain storyline that you can do that, screw the rest of the world. The Atlantic and Pacific Ocean are wide and deep, and we can just put our head in the sand. I mean, Zelensky kind of tried to tell Trump that, what's happening in the Ukraine will one day affect the United States, just like what happened between, Germany, Russia, and Poland one day did affect the world and cost 50 million people dead and destruction of many of the countries around the world. And so, that ostrich strategy has never worked well for the United States, but here we are tempting and looking to do it again.
You mentioned China, and China's obviously a focal point for Trump as well. They have a very different system of government there. They're number 2 economy in the world, manufacturing powerhouse, and obviously there's tension around things like Taiwan and the situation there. How do you see America moving forward in the context of a healthy relationship with China? Because it seems like the path that we're on right now is not the best.
At the end of the day, every country has disagreements with other countries, but I don't see any fundamental problem between the U.S. and China. Yeah, there's 2 different systems of government. They're good at some things. We're good at some things. The world is better off because of that rivalry and the diversity between those two systems and whatnot. And, China might want to take over Taiwan. Apparently, our government wants to take over Canada and Greenland. Like that type of stuff is out there. But in terms of the systems and whatnot, like China does amazing things in a whole bunch of industries, just like the U.S. does. And I just want to make sure that both countries have access to one another's markets and whatnot. I wish more of our service companies could compete in China. I wouldn't mind if Chinese cars that are electric, that are using different technologies and bring those costs down, would come here. Let's just have a healthy competition. It's like in bike racing, like the top guys in bike racing, they race like hell against each other during the race. And after it's over, they, sit back, kick off and have a beer, right? And then get ready for the next race. And so the world does well with that type of competition. I don't know why we have to turn it into a demonization contest. And I'm looking forward. I'm expecting to go to China later this year myself. I'd like to figure out how what we're doing would work in China. And so if something comes out of the Trump administration that actually does open up markets, I'll be the first to take off my hat and say, thank you for opening up the markets. And that would be terrific. I haven't seen any of that happen yet, but if that actually did come out of this, I will eat some crow and say thank you to the Trump administration for actually opening up markets in China. But it didn't happen in the first term. And I haven't seen any of those conversations being constructive yet, but I wouldn't put it beyond them. So I will give them the benefit of the doubt. But in the meantime, it just looks like a beatdown, and again, self-imposed.
Going back to some of those leadership tenets that you mentioned, how does that manifest in the companies that you're building and the ecosystem that you're developing?
Sure. Sometimes I give the example of Boeing versus Airbus. I mean, Boeing used to own the commercial airliner market. It has a very top-down model. Airbus came along. There's a bunch of ruffian Europeans saying we're going to try to figure out how to build a plane with, you do the wings in this country, you do the engine here, the fuselage. And it seemed very unlikely that this sort of bottom-up approach of a bunch of different European countries and companies could actually pull together a viable alternative to Boeing. And yet they have. They've arguably taken equal or even more market share of the world commercial airline model. And they did it bottom up rather than top down, because there's not a all-powerful Airbus company that tells everybody what to do. That has to be negotiated between all the parts. And so some industries, that can work. It's a messier model. Birth is messy, especially when it's bottom up versus top down. But, the top down approach doesn't always end up winning. And so something like Visa or MasterCard, they were a consortium of banks. And some of the things we're looking to do with getting a bunch of banks together to build a better alternative to stablecoins is probably going to look more like Airbus than it looks like Boeing. And so both models can work. We're working on one that looks more like Airbus right now, but I'm not against the Boeing model. I'm just trying to assemble the coalition of the willing, because I don't get to be king like president of Boeing and just make a bunch of unilateral decisions and stuff. And so it's easy to make a Boeing-like choice if you have that power. But given that I don't have that power, I have to work the only way I know how. It's just bottom up and herding cats to basically build something to like compete.
Well, thank you, Greg, for the conversation. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, just that it is it's an amazing time in our country. Things that I thought I would never be hearing us, give up, which is like leadership internationally, sort of an end to the melting pot. My message to America is, this is still an amazing, fantastic place to work. I hope this is just a period of temporary insecurity and doubt about our potential over our capability and our leadership. And I do hope in the years coming, both politically and economically, we actually recognize we're pretty damn good, and we ought to like double down on what we're good at, as opposed to basically adopting a loser strategy. And, that's what I'm seeing out there. I would actually comment that while it might sound very negative about some of the things the Trump administration is doing, for our particular industry, it's all great. The planets are aligned. And so there's this disconnect going on right now where our particular industry has benefited incredibly from the change in administration. And so that's what's really got me scratching my head. How can things be so good for us and so bad in adjacent sectors economically and politically that, the country's managed to like wipe trillions and trillions of dollars out of people's 401k accounts, and obviously put a bunch of people at risk that the concept of due process is really at risk in this country. And this concept of you're innocent until proved guilty is being so lightly dismissed. I find that very distressing, and I don't find it much comfort that our own industry has benefited so enormously. And I personally have benefited enormously, but it doesn't make me blind to what's happening to adjacent industries and other individuals that aren't as, privileged and lucky as I and we are. Every day I open up the paper and I hope I see a better direction. And every day I'm looking to ask for our own team, what can we do in our own particular sector? And I'll go back to your opening point. Open banking and fair access. That means in our part of the world, if there's a silver lining, let's make open banking and fair access work. And so we're going to keep doubling down. That's the biggest impact we can have, even against all the headwinds of this other activity that's going on in the marketplace.
Sounds good to me. Thank you, Greg, and we'll see you on the next one.